I'm really happy to be able to talk with this group. I think that all of the presentations this morning gave us a good sense of beginning of a range of the applications with geospatial technologies going on here at Cornell, and also hinted at some of the things that we as a geospatial interested community are figuring out how to grapple with. What are the new technologies, things like ArcGIS Online, that are out there, and how can we begin to use those in our campus? And really basic minutia, like how do we manage students coming in and out of a class and credits and things like that, to much bigger community level conversations about, there's a lot of interesting demand out there, big range of applications. How do we begin to figure out as a community how we're going to support this into the future, especially as we're about to have some retirements by some of the key people who've played a role in this before. So I'm a little bit of an outsider to the community. I'm relatively new to Ithaca. I work for something called UCGIS, which is a 20-year-old nonprofit that does a lot with geospatial technologies and GI science and higher education. We have about 60 universities that are part of us. I'm a geographer by background, a geographer by training, and I'm one of those types of people that that Françoise was referencing, who make good consultants. You have to be able to think about GIS as a way of thinking, and spatial analysis as a way of thinking, when one minute you might be talking with somebody doing a really interesting application of health mapping in Africa, and the next moment you've got to talk about soil science here in Tompkins County. So you understand spatial analysis from a introductory perspective, and then you have to be able to think about a lot of different applications. So what I want to do today, in the time that I have with you all, is talk about a little bit of, we're going to call it like an environmental scan. We had some great presentations right before lunch about, from Françoise and Wendy, about how there's certain areas on campus that serve this cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary role with things like statistics and data management. In a way, spatial analysis and the use of these types of technologies are very much fit into that same approach. And we're going to look at an environmental scan about how some other institutions in higher ed have been dealing with that. Okay, you gave me here it is. Oops. I broke it. Okay, what I want to begin with here is a graph type of thing you can pull off of Google Books Ngram Viewer, and this is not designed to be an authoritative, comprehensive picture of all of the ways that that the ideas behind geography and spatial can be captured out there. But this is an interesting thing that I just want to pull out. I pulled out from American English. I don't know if you guys have ever played with this before, but what I did is I took the words spatial and geography, and I asked for American English, and we go back here to about 1800. And what I want to point out right here is right around 1880, the increase in the use of the word spatial. And all just means you could have it capitalized in any way. And then here's the word geography. We haven't used the word geography very much today. Cornell doesn't have a department of geography. Cornell's never had a really full official department of geography, although many geographers have worked here over the years. Cornell does have a lot of people in their teaching and their research that use the word spatial, and Cornell is not alone in that. In the last 50 years, the use of that word spatial has gone way up. We're not going to go into all the reasons why geography as a discipline, as a word, as an idea of how to think about the world has in many ways decreased in popularity, and this is an important thing, not just in the words from books that Google has digitized here, but there's a lot of American higher education history that goes on with this decreasing trend there in the use of the word geography. But today I want to talk about spatial, and I brought up this graph right here because if we were to have time to go into this further, we would see a lot of interesting things in higher ed with spatial. We would see new journals that have come out in the last 20 years across many disciplines that are taking spatial approaches. We could take a look at a really interesting study if someone has taken the last 20 years of abstracts submitted to NSF across every discipline that NSF funds and look at this fascinating increase in the word spatial within these abstracts. We can take a look at programs in higher education that have literally dropped the word geography and added the word spatial and increased the degree to which students are now interested in that program and the way that they're able to recruit external funding. What's a lot of the interesting stuff behind that is, again, not something that we're going to have time to go into today. But we are now able to take, only about 20% of the universities around the US have geography departments. But if you take a slice of higher ed, you will find hardly any out there, and I mean any, that don't have some type of spatial analysis informed by some type of software out there. And I don't have the numbers from a place, we jumped right into talking about Esri software this morning. There are proprietary softwares like Esri's, which have licenses in, 85% of all of the schools in the US right now. But if you take the Esri software plus all the schools that are really dedicated to using open source, free and open source softwares, then we're up into the 90%. So you all, I don't need to talk to this group about the what of GIS and geospatial. I just want to take just a moment right here to say a little bit about the why. We know that the traditional venues in higher education have come from geography and geomatics, have come from departments and schools of planning, have been natural resources and management, and environmental science. 50 years ago, that's really would have found this. What we've seen now is a huge increase in the use of GIS and GIS programs in community colleges. The liberal arts and sciences are booming with GIS right now. We've seen a big increase in social sciences. We know that even at Cornell, we saw a history of that here, where it started with agronomy and other fields in the natural sciences, and now we've got courses in the social sciences. Humanities, GIS in the humanities with digital humanities is really big right now. I'm interested in particular also where schools of education are now picking this up. How can we use tools that use spatial education, tools that support spatial thinking in how we train teachers? And this is especially relevant with the new Common Core that we definitely won't have time to go into right now. But spatial thinking and the Common Core have important connections. We see the use of GIS and spatial analysis in professional schools and also specific programs that have begun in intelligence, law enforcement, and security. Why? If we were to take a big slice of higher education and say, why would anyone be interested in this? We're going to get different answers from all the different sectors of higher ed. We know that students want to have these things for the marketplace. We know that it's a marketable job skill for workforce. It's really clear on a campus like Cornell how important it is for GIS and spatial analysis to support research across all different disciplines. We know that in some programs, it's competition for students to recruit to it. You can't have an undergraduate degree in environmental science these days without being able and call yourself in that top group and be competitive for top students unless the students have some experience with GIS, same with planning these days. And we also saw some good beginning examples right now of how GIS is more and more being used to manage the business of the university. So we saw that today with the planning examples. There are also a lot of secondary reasons that are of interest to me as a scholar of pedagogy. The way that spatial technologies like this can enhance critical thinking. We've already talked a little bit about the huge role of GIS in visualization in general. I'm going to focus on a couple examples later of some sustainability as well. But some of these are some of the reasons of why we find ourselves at this turning point right now where we're questioning how to go forward here at Cornell. But what I'm really going to do is spend the next 20 minutes or so talking about some models of implementation, support, and instruction. And this is a little bit of that, as I said, this is going to be a little bit like an environmental scan. We just heard already how Cornell has, for example, a statistical consulting unit as that standalone center and their support model. We saw a little bit about how research works. In the last couple of jobs that I've had an opportunity to work with 100 different universities across the US and some internationally too that are trying to answer some of these questions for themselves. So Cornell is not in a unique position, but it's interesting to see how some of the peer institutions, how they've grappled with this and what kind of choices they've made to figure out how they're going to meet some of the demand on their campuses. And one of the things right away that differentiates a lot of schools is whether they have a geography department or not. As I said, about 20% of the universities in the US have some kind of degree granting geography department. And in those cases, a lot of times you've got faculty there who might be that source of expertise. That, of course, that department is not ever really in a position to serve some kind of capacity across campus. They're serving their own students. But when it's a smaller school, that might really be the only sole cluster of GIS activity on a campus. It's almost unheard of right now for a geography department in the US to not have at least one GIS person. Even the big schools that resisted it for a long time, like UC Berkeley, now have GIS people. Other times what you have is on campuses are, for example, like a standalone GIS center. This would be very similar in many ways to what we just saw as we heard about as the standalone consulting unit that Cornell has. It could be a standalone center. Many other schools have those affiliated with their libraries. For example, a library and some kind of connection with information services makes a lot of sense because you're dealing with big data sets. Librarians are very good at working with data and helping people find data. But the library itself is often a neutral place on campus. So a lot of times you end up having that center, that locus of GIS activity also in that neutral place. Sometimes GIS centers are affiliated with one area or one department or area of expertise. For example, if you've got environmental science or statistics, for example, you might have a center affiliated with that. A lot of places have GIS specialists. You can get training and become a GIS specialist. It might be somebody with a master's degree. For example, Keith Jenkins fills that role a lot here on campus. He's affiliated with a library more than one particular department. But as I go through this, I also want to highly emphasize these are not mutually exclusive. Many campuses, especially the size of Cornell, like the size of a small city, are going to have a lot of these different situations in place. One thing that I haven't heard, anyone here from Instructional Technology or Academic Computing? Yay, I see one hand up there. On many campuses, individuals with that who fill those roles have a much greater presence within GIS on campus. You can't take an instructional technologist that previously had been supporting Blackboard and saying, okay, now next week you're going to do ArcGIS. You can't home grow GIS specialists like that from instructional technology. However, that place on a campus makes a lot of sense to develop some GIS support expertise, whether it's former or whether they start developing it on campus. There are places that end up bringing in a lot of adjuncts. You know, I'm an adjunct here at Cornell. I happen to live in this community and I've got some expertise and I'm able to contribute to that. But there are other campuses that rely much more heavily on adjuncts to be able to support their fluctuating needs. Frequently, you end up with people being hired on a short-term basis because they've got some kind of grant funding. Sometimes you have places where there's a faculty who's got expertise, and this is what Ithaca College is doing as we speak right now. There's a computer science faculty who knows something about GIS, and he uses an open source quantum GIS program, and other faculty at Ithaca College are able to apply to take that class. They get a course release, they learn some QGIS along the way, and then other students, undergraduate students in that are also learning along with the faculty and fulfill some of the support role. So that's the way that Ithaca College, which does not use Esri software, does not have an Esri site license, is able to meet some of the faculty professional development needs and the student instructional needs in their own particular culture. Student interns can't live with them, can't live without them. I also want to say that another situation, number of schools either use postdocs, fellows who support fluctuating needs on campus, or postbacks. You've got a situation where a student has graduated, has strong GIS skills, isn't quite sure what they want to do in graduate school yet, and they're able to stay on campus and serve a support role in some, for example, teaching assistant, that type of thing. They're very good. They just themselves went through that learning experience of GIS as an undergraduate. They're very effective communicators with their fellow peers. So there's a whole bunch of models out there that are in play right now that they all have their pros and cons. None of these are mutually exclusive. Some of these might be the thing that Cornell might start working towards in the future. And I'm going to just show now, I'm going to show a couple of actual examples from some different schools, some bigger ones, some you might consider peer institutions more than others. One of the universities in the US that has made one of the biggest commitments to this in terms of human resources as well as other types of infrastructure is University of Minnesota. They've got a whole spatial program, support for spatial research. They have a director, they have other types of support staff. Minnesota happens to have a geography department, but this again is a standalone entity. They are able to have programmers on staff that help with different types of projects. Sustainability is a huge issue for this campus as well. They've just created this really great Minnesota Solar Suitability Analysis app, which is winning all sorts of prizes around there. It's one of those projects that really crosses the expectations that University of Minnesota is going to be doing with research, instruction, and outreach and extension. They also have a very well organized and implemented sustainability project in all. It's called It All Adds Up. Energy, recycling, and reuse, transportation, purchasing. All of these are the types of things that can happen at Cornell and elsewhere. What you see when you look at this is that enterprise level of GIS across the whole campus really makes the difference between just having a standalone map right now that we have with our bike racks, which is really important. We have to start with inventory, but only when you have that inventory, then you start to get the ideas that move it up from just simple maps up to entire successful sustainability initiatives. UMass Amherst also has an award-winning sustainability initiative as for their campus as an institution, which is all involves spatial analysis and GIS underneath it. So they've got their diagram here that talks about their relationship between the Earth and their particular institution, and it's actually GIS, which, as they say right here, brings it all together. Again, UMass Amherst, both of these places I've talked about so far have really robust websites that will give you more details on all the specific things they've built. One of the things that UMass has, which is really noteworthy, is their particular master plan, which goes out till 2021, which has a story map. They've taken one of those templates that we were looking at before, and this is an online story map. But they also have a master plan explorer, which really lets the larger community access through this interface all of those other rich data sets, sustainability oriented, that they've pulled together. Harvard, peer institution of Cornell. Harvard got rid of its geography department in 1948, and after it did that, a lot of other schools followed suit within the Ivy Leagues. Dartmouth is the only one that still has a full-blown degree-granting geography department. 10 years ago this year is when Harvard was able to relaunch something they call the Center for Geographic Analysis, CGA. It made a lot of headlines because people were saying that now Harvard is bringing back geography. What Harvard's really done is it's brought back spatial analysis supported by GIS in a very robust way. And in fact, Julia Finkelstein, our organizer here, is still affiliated with Harvard CGA as one of their fellows. Harvard CGA is a well-funded, relatively well-funded initiative. I like the way that they've identified these different types of things that we've been talking about already, the idea that you're going to be supporting research and teaching, you're strengthening GIS infrastructure on campus, it's the same kind of data and software training we've been talked about before, and they operate a help desk for the community as well. So theirs is one of those standalone centers that we described before, which really has now begun to serve people all across campus. They're having a big 10-year anniversary this coming spring. On the other hand, you have a place like Yale, which also can support initiatives like that. Yale has not gone in the way of having a standalone center. Yale has, it's not that there aren't plenty of people around Yale using GIS, But for the most part, on campus, they've got, if you know Yale GIS, then you know this gentleman, Stacy Maples, who is phenomenal. Stacy is brilliant. He's based at the library. On his LinkedIn thing, it says, expert generalist in the application of geospatial technology in all application areas. So Stacy gave a talk this past weekend over at the Northeast Arc Users Conference. It was Tales of a Geospatial Swiss Army Knife, Managing Geospatial Support at Yale with a Staff of One. He's a phenomenal programmer, so he's able to put together, he's able to do a lot of custom work for faculty and students in streamlining things because he can customize things and program things very well. Some of people, Keith, other people in the room know Stacy. That's a situation where Yale has not, I don't know if they're having parallel conversations like this right now, but at this point, they've really banked a lot on having one individual who's able to put extraordinary expertise to the benefit of the campus community as a whole. UPenn also doesn't have a geography department. Their expertise is not centralized either, so we're also looking at centralized models versus a little bit more distributed. Penn has some particular programs and departments that have really, at the department level, really invested heavily in spatial analysis and GIS. Their School of Design has this. They also, Penn, the Wharton School, so their School of Business actually has the longest history of using spatial analysis in business applications of any of the others. Cartographic Modeling Lab mostly focuses on social science applications. Stanford is another school that does not have a standalone center. Stanford has a lot of GIS expertise at their library, especially their Earth Sciences library. But one thing that Stanford is particularly notable for is that it's their history department that has invested in spatial analysis really more than any other single department on campus. They have the spatial history project you can find. They're mostly grant funded, but also university-wide as well. Really exemplary examples of what you can do with humanities and spatial analysis. University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, a big public school trying to figure out how to manage a big thing there. They've also decided, for the most part, right now what's going on is their Cyber GIS Center, which is now started out as a sole research funded entity and is now trying to get itself a little bit bigger and wrap itself around some of the other things on campus. They'll now talk about the humanities, but this is big data. The Cyber GIS Center and its founders are GIS scientists who are really focused on asking interesting spatial questions with massively large data sets. So that's, that computational side of it is their area of expertise. Slightly smaller schools, we've got places like Tufts, which is internationally recognized as having a really well-organized system, also standalone, also for the most part library-based, physically library-based, but also in their approach to data. They have people who are very good at helping campus-wide manage data sets. They also have people that can help program things, which is an important part. University of Southern California, also a slightly smaller school. USC had a geography department. This is a great story. They now have what's called the Spatial Sciences Institute, which is one of the most rapidly growing academic entities on their pretty well-funded campus. USC had a geography department. It went through a review in the early 2000s or mid-2000s at this point, and it wasn't. They decided that too many of the faculty were going in different directions. It was kind of floundering like many geography departments have. It was closed. The USC geography department closed on a Friday. On Monday, they reopened as the USC Spatial Sciences Institute. They now have more faculty. They have a waiting list for students. They have new degree programs. They are a star poster child at USC because they have done a phenomenal job at rebranding themselves, but they're still asking some of the basic questions that geographers have always asked. And now the smallest school I'm going to talk about, the little tiny University of Redlands, where I was for a number of years. Little tiny campus, 2,500 undergraduate students. It's a private, it happens to share a zip code with Esri in Redlands. There is no other connection, really, there's not. It's a small private 100-year-old liberal arts college. And we have more faculty there I would say proportionally, we have 5 times more faculty at Redlands doing stuff with GIS in research and teaching than at Cornell or some of the other schools I've talked about. They call themselves a spatially infused learning community. At least that's the nice thing we made up as we were doing it. And these are all the different, these are just a fraction of the different people and programs using GIS. But one of the things that was really important as we started to work with people and do some outreach on campus about GIS is we didn't call it GIS. Everybody in Redlands know what GIS is. It's that Jack Dangerman business on the other side of town. That was software. We're a liberal arts college. We don't do software. That was big data for pipelines and industry. We're asking questions that invoke spatial, critical thinking and understanding about the big questions and disciplines. Yeah, eventually you might be using some software to try to get at those questions, but really at that really important learning level, we have visualization communication, we have spatial analysis, and we have understanding place. And you can use software to get at some of those things, and sometimes you're not using software, but that's at the core of what people really want to do, whether we end up calling it GIS&T or not. So returning to this as part of the mission of what any center or group might do is really important. It's not all about software. I'm almost done with these slides right now, but is it all about Esri? No, of course not. The International Cartographic Association and the Open Source GEO Initiative, 2 big, well-respected international groups, started a little bit ago something called GEO for All. This is an interesting international group, although now they have 90 labs as of this past weekend, and many of them are in the US as well. But this is for universities who are never going to have Esri site licenses. Why not? Maybe they can't afford them, but they're also not going to be able to have the faculty and the capacity to keep going. They're not going to be able to manage ArcGIS Online for organizations. And their students are not going to be able to ever have access to Esri or Esri software again. So this is a group that's done an excellent job at creating a community of practice, a global community practice using exclusively open source, free and open source geospatial tools. And I think it's really neat the progress that they've made. They now have 90 schools. Again, you need being part of a group is helpful in this. We have common questions that we want to ask. To have universities across the world be able to help each other figure out some of these questions is an important thing to be able to do. So I think this GEO for All initiative is pretty cool. In general, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are fantastic, exciting, interesting, innovative technologies being used out there with questions about data privacy. There are all sorts of really cool, we saw pictures of some really high-tech unmanned aerial surveys in some of Steve's early talks. You can get students just as interested in the types of remote sensing questions that you can ask with those UASs, whether you're building a balloon and putting it together yourself with things from Home Depot, or getting data, downloading data from some massive systems out there. There are people who are looking at the spatial side of this from a cognitive psychology side, which is pretty interesting too. And there are people who are looking to formalize this in curriculum. UCSB, University of California, Santa Barbara was the first school out there to have a minor in spatial studies. Several others have followed that since. But what does it mean to have an academic minor where students could be taking classes from 5 of the different departments that are represented in this room right now? Recently, Santa Barbara hosted a spatial thinking across the college curriculum that began to ask that. What would it mean to have a gen ed requirement in which students had to demonstrate some kind of capacity for spatial thinking and spatial reasoning? That really gets, we have a common interest in this room in something about geospatial. What would it mean if we can talk not just about some kind of entity that might help us with our spatial questions, but what would it mean to be thinking about the curriculum across campus that students would experience? So, oops, wrong way. So I want to leave it at that. I'm hoping, I think I have left just a little bit of time right now for some questions. As I said, I'm here on the campus rather infrequently because I fill an adjunct role on this campus, but I've had a chance to teach graduate students and to teach undergraduates spatial analysis and geographic information systems. There's a lot of student interest from many different disciplines here, and I think I'm glad to see some students are here right now. I expect this only to be growing. I think we know that. We know that the interest in this is going to continue. And I think it's great that we're able to start to have these preliminary conversations as a community to help identify some of the questions that are going to come up and begin to think of some ways to address those. There's no shortage of creativity in this community, and it's an interesting way. Now we have an opportunity to apply that creativity and thoughtful planning towards something that could benefit the larger community in the next years to come. So thanks very much. Please, you can find me through my net ID. You can also find me on Twitter and other places. And I live here in Ithaca, and I'm sometimes on campus. Thanks very much. Questions? Yes. Back left.
What do you see as being the biggest barrier to using the term geography in a university setting and bringing back unified geography departments? What is it that makes the spatial science brand, so to speak, so strong?
Much of that has to do with a lot of the people who make decisions about academic curricula and departments are right now between the ages of, let's say, 45 and 65. And if you're between the ages of 45 and 65, or even 35 and 65 in this room, and you had a positive experience in your K-12 life with this thing called geography, and you had a positive experience, raise your hand. Okay, a handful. Maybe because your experiences were positive, you went on to enjoy something about geography and do something with maps, which might be a reason that you're in this room today. What we find is a distinct connection between people, a lot of times academic people involved with school planning, who find it too easy to always have reduced geography to its very basic component of things like place names, just the very basic of what, and who aren't comfortable asking some of those questions about where and how things matter and how things fit together and the patterns and places of geography, what geography really is, the spatial analysis side of geography. We don't teach that in our schools. Most people discover programs of geography. Geography is one of those departments you discover if your school has it, which it probably doesn't. But if your university has it, you discover it maybe your junior year. So geography programs also have to condense a lot of their curriculum, something that somebody can finish in their junior and senior year. So that's a systemic problem with geography. Too many of people at federal levels of departments of education, the federal Department of Education includes geography as one of the subjects somebody ought to know, but in that last round, I don't know, it's probably a decade ago now, it was the only thing that got zero funding. We're saying that you ought to have geography, but we're giving you zero. So geography got subsumed by social studies. Social studies is history, geography, economics, and government. Historians are loud, and there are many of them, and they tend to dominate those conversations. So in most places, people associate social studies with history, and they're not very good at teaching geography, and therefore the textbooks aren't very good at geography. I could go on for hours about this. But it's a systemic problem that goes back to our K-12 public education, and in order to really get to the point where the geography departments have been created in the last 20 years by forward-thinking, thoughtful people who understand the importance of geographical thinking and what that can mean for people coming out with a college degree today. Can we start one at Cornell? Would we want to? Can we do much more with spatial reasoning and geographic reasoning by having informed people a lot of different places than having it in one academic silo? Joe.
Well, given your perspective and experience, my question was, do you have a recommendation or insight as to the best way to organize GIS Geospatial at Cornell?
I am still at the point of, I don't know Cornell well enough to be able, it's like what your new president said too. when they're asked something right away, what do you think about this? I don't know, you guys are coming up with some great ideas, and I think that there might not be one single solution, and who knows what's going to be supportable and fundable, and I think just having this initial conversation with people as diverse a group as this is a great thing, and that this has been organized to help foster what we hope will be those regular multidisciplinary conversations. Sure, I have some ideas for what it could be. I think that Francoise's description of a consulting unit satisfies a lot of, if we were to do a needs assessment of what's needed here, it satisfies a lot of those. How's it going to get funded? I don't know. It's working. Their model is working right now very well, it seems, or at least adequately. 3.5 FTEs for their statistical consultants. We could do a lot of work right now with 3.5 FTEs of people with spatial analysis knowledge and the ability to communicate and work with people on campus. That'd be pretty great. Other questions? Yes.
One last question.
Sorry, thanks.
So I'll just yell. So this is just suggestions or comments more so than questions, but I was at that conference as well, and I saw Stace's talk as well, and it was equally impressed. And so I would definitely recommend including whatever is part of the mix as far as geospatial technology is taught and used here on campus. I would definitely recommend that open source and web mapping be a big part of it, not just Esri. And also encourage students and faculty to work with organizations and make partnerships in the community. Mm-hmm. And a little plug for the county-based extensions. Reach out to us county-based extensions and work with us. We're plugged into the local communities.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, Diana, very much.